Hello, my name is Tom Godfrey. I'm a teacher trainer and director at ITI Istanbul. I want to talk about historical approaches to English language teaching. Why is it important to look at the history of how English language has been taught? Well, all of these approaches are trying to answer the question, how do we learn languages? One way to start considering the question, how do we learn languages, is to consider how do we as humans learn in general. How do we learn, for example, mathematics, or how to drive, or how to swim, or how to walk? Well, generally, we don't learn everything in the same way. Broadly speaking, there are two distinct processes. If we consider mathematics or driving, then we learn through instruction. Someone shows us the rules and the principles, and we learn by applying those rules. And this is a conscious process, a kind of problem-solving process. And this is referred to as deductive learning. But if we consider how to walk, or how to make sounds, or how to breathe, then nobody tells us what to do. This is done through experience. We learn through experience. We learn by doing things. If I touch something hot and I thought, oh, that's hot, I won't do that again. And we learn by observing and imitating and copying. And this is unconscious. We just learn these skills without really thinking about them. And this is described as inductive learning. So how do we learn our first language as a baby? Well, clearly this is an inductive process. We acquire the language through exposure to it. We learn the rules, but they're not made explicit. They're internalized. We're not conscious of them. If you ask a child why they say, my name is John, and not my name am John, for example, they wouldn't know. That's the way it's done. So babies learn their languages in an order. First mummy, daddy, then objects, cake, verbs, I want cake. And we don't correct babies. Well, we do. For example, if my son said, look, daddy, cup, I'd say, good boy, yes, that's a cup, well done. I wouldn't say, no. Third person singular s, that is indefinite article, cup. So although on the other hand, if my son said, look daddy, cake, I'd say, no, that's not a cup, that's not a cake, it's a cup. So we correct content but not form. So logically this would lead to children speaking the truth in a very ungrammatical, inaccurate way. But in fact, in reality, it's the opposite. So we learn our first language inductively. However, language learning in schools and universities in the last 300-400 years has been taught in a deductive manner, using an approach called grammar translation. And this method was designed to teach languages such as Latin and Greek. And the language was studied as a tool to explore the cultures of these classical civilizations, rather than to learn the language to speak, to use. But it still forms the basis of much English teaching in schools throughout the world. And the method of language learning, although it's not based on a psychology of learning, there are a number of assumptions implicit in the model. And that is that language learning involves grammatical rules, and the learner needs to apply these rules accurately. There's a lot of memorization, long lists of vocabulary, and all meaning is conveyed in the first language. So there is a lot of translation from the target language into L1. Obviously, students and the teacher speak in their mother tongue. Everything is very deductive. Classes are essentially teacher-centered. And the theory of learning could best be described as what is taught is learnt. So how do we learn languages? Essentially, this is a philosophical question. What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of existence? But in practical terms, it's answered and approached from different perspectives, different disciplines. First of all, we have psychology. Psychologists look at this question from a broadly scientific approach, looking at empirical evidence, borrowing a lot from medical research. We have linguists who look at the language itself and compare and contrast languages and look at the systems of the language. And we have sociologists who tend to look at how the language is used in society. And their approach is much more ethnographic, much more descriptive. In terms of psychologies that have influenced language learning and the theories of language learning, we have behaviorism, which behaviorists very much believed that learning was inductive, that we learn through habit formation, that we learn through conditioning, responding to stimuli in a certain way. Then we have the opposite view of the mentalists, who believe that language learning is a conscious process that involves applying rules and is much more deductive. And then we have the influence of humanism, and humanists look at the learner themselves and the factors, their emotional well-being and the factors that will affect them from learning. And in terms of approaches, well, we've looked at how babies learn their first language, grammar translation, which has been predominant in the last 300 or 400 years. We're going to go and look at the direct method, which is an inductive approach and evolved into audio-lingualism, which was heavily influenced by behaviorism. And then look at the reaction to this, the cognitive codes, the mentalists' view of language, and how this evolved into the communicative. So the direct method was a reaction against grammar translation and totally avoided the use of the first language. It looked at everyday language and focused on dialogues, question and answer. And the most famous followers were Sever and Berlitz, whose schools today follow an almost identical method using lots of realia, stressing accurate pronunciation. The direct method stressed the importance of speech and believed that second language acquisition is a similar process to learning your first language. In other words, a great deal of exposure, practice, developing oral skills, developing listening skills and comprehension. And the procedure consisted of lots of visuals, and language was input through dialogues and drilling. And many of these techniques are practiced today. I mean, particularly the PPP lesson format. Then followed audio-lingualism, which was based on behaviorist psychology and the concept of learning as habit formation. It was, and the key name here, of course, is Skinner, whose book Verbal Behavior came out in 1957. But audio-lingualism was also based on the school of American structuralism, which placed form above meaning and showed that language could be broken down into patterns or lists, structural patterns. And these ideas were influenced by the anthropologist Leo Bloomfield, who gained notoriety with his attempts to document the language of Native American Indians in patterns. So the aim of the audio-lingual lesson was to produce an automatic speech habit, constant drilling, constant reinforcement. Also, this is when the cassette player was introduced, so a lot of language laboratories were constructed. Errors were immediately corrected, as this would provide negative reinforcement, and the student was not expected to analyze the language or think about the language or work at home. So it was very much a pure inductive method. And the advantage of audiolingualism was that it was offered opportunities to learn a language to everybody, whereas in the past, language learning had always been considered an academic or an intellectual skill. The basic premise behind the cognitive code, or the mentalists, is that the relationship drawn by behaviorists in terms of language and behavior is false, and that language is a development of an innate faculty of language acquisitions. In other words, we have a language acquisition device in our brain which enables us to use language creatively. So language learning is not a process of habit formation, and we cannot predict responses from stimuli. Responses are creative and unpredictable. And this is all based on the work of Chomsky. So basically the idea is that there are universals that underline all languages. So from a finite set of rules, an infinite number of sentences can be created. This is Chomsky's claim. And so the effect of this on the classroom was to take language study into the realms of sentence structure and to look at phonology, grammar, and lexis. And it's a throwback essentially to grammar translation. The basic principle is that learners need to be guided to discover these language rules. As a direct result of the cognitive code, there emerged a methodology called communicative language teaching. And it was Del Hymes in the early 1970s who emphasized that rules not only were linguistic rules and grammatical rules, but also relevant in social situations. So from this, we grew the distinction between linguistic competence and sociolinguistic competence. So linguistic competence is knowing the grammar, the lexis, the phonological rules, whereas sociolinguistic competence is knowing the rules of appropriacy, style, register, what language to use in social situations. And this distinction of communicative competence became more sophisticated and later included discourse competence, which are the rules of interaction in a social, in a oral conversation, such as turn taking, and also in written discourse, how the text is organized, laid out, and the rules behind its structure. And then strategic competence, so thinking about the strategies that people use in conversations, such as perhaps paraphrasing or asking for repetition, or also in other skills such as reading, guessing meaning, or in conversations guessing meaning from other clues. So we also see during this period the influence of humanist psychology. Humanism evolved from encounter groups of Carl Rogers, a psychologist in the United States. And these emphasize the importance of the learner in all learning situations. And humanist psychology believed that affective factors and a learner's emotional state are the key influencing factors in any learning encounter. And teaching, in their view, is subservient to learning. And we see the influence of humanistic psychology in such methods as silent way, suggestopedia, community language learning, and TPR. And these methods have provided us with a wealth of classroom activities. So, for example, we have cues and air rods and elicitation techniques from silent way. We have relaxation, breathing, music from suggestopedia, the use of recordings and negotiated syllabuses through community language learning, and action and doing and responding to instructions in TPR. One of the key figures in the 1980s and advocate of communicative language teaching was Stephen Krashen. The natural approach of Krashen and Tyrrell caused a lot of interest, partly because Krashen was probably the best salesman that EFL has had. And he made some key distinctions about the difference between learning and acquisition. In other words, unconscious learning through exposure to the language, and learning with conscious application of grammatical rules. And this was summarized in his 5 hypotheses. He also, the natural order hypothesis, that suggests that language is acquired in a certain order. The monitor hypothesis, that we have a monitor, that we're able to monitor our output and correct errors. The input hypothesis, that input was very important, but it had to be comprehensible input. It had to be a little bit above our current level. And the effective filter hypothesis, that how there are factors that affect our openness to learning. And essentially this was summarizing a lot of things that have been talked about before, particularly in terms of first language acquisition. So, does an analysis of the history of English language teaching approaches get us any closer to an answer about how we learn languages? Well, unfortunately, not really, as we can find anecdotal evidence to support both deductive and inductive approaches. For example, this is my son. He was born in Turkey, never studied Turkish, but can speak reasonably well and communicate. Whereas this is Aisha, who had very limited exposure to English language, studied it at school and university, and is now an English language teacher. But we can also find examples of failure as well. There are people who live in a foreign country who are exposed to the language, have the opportunities for learning but fail, or equally who study it all their lives. So although we're not able to come closer to answering the question about how best to learn the language, we are able to identify some of the questions that have preoccupied researchers, and they are the distinction between learning and acquisition. So do we learn a second language or acquire one? Do we need to focus on the rules of the language or focus on the meaning, how the language is used in context? And what about errors? What is the role of errors? Are they important? Should teachers correct errors, or is it a waste of time? Where are we now? Well, we can say that ELT approaches are dead. So we're in a period of post-method, or of critical eclecticism. And this is because the focus has shifted from methodology to the individual learner. So it's recognized that there can never be one approach fits all kind of solution. And the focus has shifted to, firstly, looking at learners' needs. And in particular, thinking about their specific needs, whether this is ESP or business English or EAP, academic English for academic purposes, and looking at the language in terms of the genre and analysing the language used in, for example, business meetings or on the telephone, the organisation of an academic paper. And this research is assisted by the technology with the ability of corpus linguists to analyse huge databases of language. Another influence has been looking at focusing on learners as individuals and looking at the differences between learners, age, gender, culture, previous learning experience, aptitude, and how these characteristics affect learning. And that learning can be differentiated according to the learner's individual characteristics, such as preferred learning styles and motivation. So input and exposure to language is recognized as important, but there's an increased focus on discourse and authentic language rather than looking at words and sentences as in the past. So language is introduced using tasks, authentic tasks, and contexts. And in 1993, Michael Lewis wrote The Lexical Approach, and in it he stated that a central element of language teaching is raising students' awareness of and developing their ability to chunk the language. So we get increased emphasis on consciousness raising and noticing tasks so that learners are able to notice activities. And also we have changes in the methodology. So for example, language is introduced with CLIL, so content and language integrated, lots of projects, and also flipped learning, where the classroom is used for language use and practice, and the input, where the learners actually analyse and study the language, is done outside the classroom at home, often using online resources. There is also an emphasis on output. Merrill Swain suggests that learning takes place when we notice a gap between what we say and what we want to say and what we're able to say. And this can only happen when we interact and we get feedback from others in a conversation. And the basic principle is that in order to improve your speaking, you need to speak. And this obviously can be extended to all skills. So in order to improve your writing, you need to write. In order to improve your reading, you need to read. So there's been an increased emphasis on skills, and particularly breaking these down into sub-skills. And similarly, if you can identify skills, then you can think about strategies to help develop those skills. So language is no longer viewed grammatically as it has been in the past, or as patterns of language that need to be reinforced through habit formation. Language now is no longer seen at sort of sentence level or verb level, but more as discourse, as whole texts, as dialogues. Thank you. My name is Tom Godfrey, and this has been a very rapid overview of historical approaches in language teaching and how they have impacted on current thought.